This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Thank you so much for coming out to see me tonight, and I feel very inspired to talk about midlife because I think it's a time where a lot of people get discouraged, and I find it a period of inspiration. So thank you again for coming, all of you. I want to start the evening with a poem by Mary Oliver, which maybe some of you know, called The Journey. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company, as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. This poem has really helped me through my midlife transition. The part she talks about finding your voice, recognizing it as your own, and having it be your companion through the times to come. I think my transition started about 7 or 10 years ago, and I found myself very disillusioned, disappointed, dissatisfied. Although I had done everything right. I had the husband, I had the 3 kids, I had a comfortable material life, I didn't really have any big stresses, and I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I did the recipe, I did the Cinderella thing, and what's wrong with me that I can't appreciate it? And so I started reading a lot of Jungian material. So I'm not a Jungian scholar per se, and what I'm going to present tonight is more what I've gleaned personally and my interpretation of the work and how I've used it for myself. What I found out is that I was very busy but bored and underused. I was in a vacuum, an intellectual and spiritual vacuum, and I was stuck in roles like we often do. We find roles like being the good parent, the good child, the good boss, and all of those things, and the stereotypical gender roles. Jung talks about finding oneself in shoes that are too small, and I certainly did that. I don't know if any of you can relate, but my life was constricting me, it was pinching me. And what I gleaned from Jung is that in the first half of life, you get yourself organized, you learn how the world works, you find a career, you have a family if that's the choice you're going to make. And the second half of life for him is when you could really do the work of becoming yourself and becoming all that you can be. So for me, it's an inspiring time after working a lot, doing a lot of inner work through it. And that's what I want to impart tonight, of how we can look at it more of a hero or a heroine's journey versus a time of terrible grieving or disillusionment or depression. Jung called this work individuation, to become all that we can become. James Hillman, who's another Jungian, calls it soul making. And it's a time also where we often find our callings. A lot of times in the first half of life, we've done something that our parents wanted us to do, or just to make money, or this or that, and haven't followed it all our heart. And by the second half of life, we have that opportunity, I think, if we take the opportunity. part of it for me has is the art of becoming my own best companion. Like the poem said, you know, having that voice to accompany you in whatever happens to you. And it's also been a time of finishing unfinished business. The idea of making the unconscious conscious is something about knowing yourself. Some people call that enlightenment, that your unconscious becomes conscious. I think at least it's evolution. And that's another opportunity that midlife gives us. There's a quote by the writer George Sand, which, I think is a slogan for midlife. It's never too late to be what you might have been. I'll say it again. It's never too late to be what you might have been. So who here is in a midlife transition? Can you throw out some adjectives for me, what it feels like, what it's like for you?
Fog.
Good one.
Free.
Free, good. Anybody?
Upward climb.
Upward climb, thanks.
Possibility.
Great.
Restless.
I like that one.
Grieving.
Grieving.
Letting go.
Joint pain.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Joint pain.
Joint pain. I could take that in two ways, by the way. If you have a partner, I'm not sure. For me, thank you for all that. For me, it's been at different times despair and depression, stuckness. I've felt a lot. Confusion, someone said fog. That's a lot like that. And grieving, I'm glad that one of you brought that up. Grieving is a really important part of midlife. I think there are things we can't go back and redo. There are crossroads that we made a different choice about, and there is a liberation after the grieving and recognizing that. So I want to talk about Jung's roadmap, and it's not a recipe, it's not a formula, it's kind of just an idea of the terrain, and it's a structure or model like any other. It doesn't mean that this is right or absolute, but this for me has really worked in my process. So it starts, can you all see well enough? Pretty much. So it starts with the self, and Jung made a differentiation between a self with a big S and a self with a little s. The self with the little s is more connected to personality, but the self with the big S, which is what I'm talking about here, is our essential self. It's also connected to the collective unconscious that connects us with everything, and our divine spark, and for whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs are, it's connected to that. What he says is that the ego, there's an axis between this self that wants to live, that wants to manifest itself. There's an axis between that and the ego. And what happens in his model, the ego should be in service to the self. The ego should make the self be lived. But often we've turned it around and it's the ego who rules, and the self kind of gets lost and restless, as you say. Above or around the persona, the ego is the persona, which is the mask or the facade that we use to navigate through our lives. And I'm going to talk about each of these points one by one as we go through the evening. But the persona isn't a bad word. Neither is the ego, which sometimes they get a bad rap. But it's when we're automatically connected to them and we let them run us versus that we're consciously using. For example, persona, like tonight, I'm a persona. I'm different than I am when I have coffee with my friend Melissa. But I'm conscious of that, and I'm not identified with that. It's not who I am all the time. And you can see here the ego, part of this is living in the conscious world and part of it unconscious. So all of this work that he describes as making as much of the unconscious conscious, which is never going to be completely 100% possible. Underneath the self is the shadow. And the shadow is anything unlived in us, repressed, or rejected. And it wants to be known. It's an important part of the psyche. And we're going to talk a lot about the shadow later on. Filled up in the psyche also are archetypes. And I'm not going to talk a lot about all the archetypes, but I want to talk about the Anima and Animus, which are kind of confusing terms, but basically the Anima is what a man has as his inner template of woman, and Animus is what a woman has as her inner template of a man. And we're going to talk a lot about that later too. But I want you, while I'm talking, to have the map so that as we talk about each aspect, you can orient yourself. What we'll do for questions is right before the break, I'll have time for questions. We'll finish up with 10 minutes, and then at the very end, I'll have time for questions. So we'll split it into two. So the first thing I want to talk about is the persona. And the roadmap is not linear, but the persona is usually the easiest, the least complex thing to start working on. And there's a quote by an author, Jonathan Safran Foer. It's from a novel called Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. And his hero is has anybody here read that book? No? It's a wonderful book. His hero is a 9-year-old boy. And at one point he asks one of his elders, do anybody's insides and outsides match up? And I love this quote. His answer, the response that he got is, maybe that's what a person's personality is, the difference between the inside and the outside. So this speaks a lot to me about congruence. The idea that to do persona work, we want as much of our insides to match up with our outsides. What happens when we're born and raised is we develop a false self to survive in the environment in which we're born, to get love or to not get punished or to do what we have to do to get the most favorable outcome. And over the years, this false self or strategic self gets built up. And first it starts with our parents and caregivers, and then it goes on to teachers, to religious groups sometimes, to authority figures or society at large. I was just reading yesterday a quote. I found a quote that I liked about authenticity that I wanted to share with you. The search for authenticity is discovering a way to live according to one's inner sense rather than in obedience to or rebellion against the dictate of others. So I think that says a lot about how to start looking at how we have set up a false self. Another part of it is from what the messages we get from society. Has anyone here heard the expression consensus trance? Consensus trance. It's basically what some people believe. We get hypnotized into believing in our society and to whichever society that we're born into. Now there's some useful things about consensus trance, like we all agree to drive on the same side of the road. So that's a positive and helpful thing that we all agree on and don't question. On the other hand, take something like nudity. I lived in France for a long time and my kids were born there. And in France, nudity is not a big deal. If you go to the beach or the swimming pool, there's women of all ages and sizes who are topless, and it's not a big deal. And here it's called indecent exposure, and it's illegal. So it's important, I think, to look at the ways that we have beliefs based on society as well as our parents and teachers and caregivers. There's a psychoanalyst named Karen Horney who was one of Freud's disciples, and she coined the term the tyranny of the shoulds. And that was a real icon for me when I heard that. For example, when I first started doing some serious inner work, I always said yes to people. I really had a hard time saying no, and I think that's pretty common. And so I started feeling conflicted about this. It wasn't going well for me, but I didn't know. I got too anxious to say no when somebody wanted me to do something. So I first started to say to myself, well, at least admit to myself if I didn't want to do it. And I gave myself permission not to change my behavior, because the anxiety level would get so high that I couldn't do it. But little by little, I drove that wedge of consciousness into the shoulds, so that eventually I could more easily say no when I wanted to say no. And I also want to give you a word right now about anxiety. There's a wonderful writer named James Hollis, he's a Jungian also, who says that when we're dealing with our status quo, if we stay in our status quo, we risk being depressed. And if we want to change our status quo, the risk is being anxious. So if one is aware of that, I think it's easier to make a choice and to know that that anxiety is part of the normal passage of any change, even if your mind is in total agreement that it's a positive change. We're so hardwired in our survival methods that when that starts changing, it's very frightening. So as well as all those things, there's the roles we take, like I said before, the stereotypes, and even a black sheep is a role that we take. Sometimes the counter stances we take are also just as much that we're affected by people. It's not really necessarily our true self. So the point in persona work is becoming more authentic and less strategic. I've been doing yoga for about 5 years, and about 3 years into it, I realized that no matter what pose I was in, I had this smile kind of fixed to my face. And I was amazed. I mean, I remember being upside down saying, why am I smiling? But it wasn't I was smiling because I was happy and joyful to be there. It was this persona mask. It became a great kind of icon for me to remember to drop into something more authentic. So with each section, I want to give you some ideas about tools. And I'm speaking from personal experience, the things that have helped me. So one of the tools for persona work is noticing when you're thinking should, or saying should, or hearing from somebody else should, and starting to question whose voice is saying should. Is it my mother's? Is it my first grade teacher's? Is it my husband's? And really starting to tease apart where's your own voice in that. What do you really think? What do you really feel? What do you really want? Another thing that I worked on was when I found myself wanting to get attention or wanting to impress or wanting to present a certain image. When I noticed it, I tried to stop. I tried to refrain from that behavior and try to give myself the attention that I wanted instead of looking for it outside. And in that way, and this wouldn't be everybody's way, but that's when I think I started my real spiritual practice of a connection with God and feeling like he or she saw me and appreciated me and could pat me on the back. And that really helped me break this kind of dependence or even addiction in some cases to external feedback and reinforcement, and what I would do to get the persona issues. The third thing is really very difficult. We could spend the whole night talking about just this. It's working on defense mechanisms. And I heard a quote once that defense mechanisms are the glue that holds the false self in place. And when you look at it that way, it's pretty crucial to inner work. Some people, when they're first starting, don't even know when they're being defensive, and I can only talk about what it is for me, but I'll notice almost a fight stance. I'll feel it in my body. I'll feel a lot of adrenaline here. I'll feel like I'm girding up somewhere, and I feel sticky. I feel like I'm overreacting. I feel triggered. And so those are just kind of things to look at in that. So the next thing I want to talk about is the shadow. The shadow has gotten a very bad rap, I think. The shadow, I think people tend to think it's violence or aggression or anger. We put the bad things in there. And what Robert Bly, who's a Jungian poet and author, says is the shadow is the long black bag that we drag behind us. So when we're kids, we right away start putting things in the bag. The teacher says we're coloring outside the lines. Our creativity goes in the bag. Our parents tell us not to masturbate. Our sexuality goes in the bag. We're too wild at home. Our exuberance goes into the bag, or our aliveness. So it's not just negative things that get put in there. There's all kinds of things. There's a lot of energy that we tie up in the shadow. First of all, there's a lot of energy that we expend to keep those things down. And if we had that free, we'd be a lot more creative and a lot less obsessed with things, I believe. And there's also a lot of gold in the shadow. Number one, take something like anger, where anger is often in our society put in the bag. And yet it's something we need to stick up for ourselves, or to stick up for when there's injustice being done around us. The other thing with the gold in the bag is all the things that we talked about already, the creativity, the sexuality, exuberance. In other generations, and maybe still today in certain parts of the world, girls were taught to put their intelligence in the bag, because it might queer a love or a matchmaking, getting married. They couldn't be smarter than their husbands. So all those things we need to get back, we need to bring it all back into our whole psyche so that we have all of that to work with. I looked up the word integrate because I thought that's a word that a real buzzword right now about integration. What does it mean to integrate the shadow? And the dictionary says to bring together or incorporate parts into a whole, which makes perfect sense when you talk about becoming whole and developing a relationship with all those parts of ourselves. I want to give some examples from some film and literature. The first one is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And there's a great example of Dr. Jekyll, who's this saintly good doctor, and his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, who's vulgar, crass, violent, despicable, all these things. So you've got a portrait of a man who's really living one-sided and not integrated. What's said about something like anger, when it gets put into the bag, it becomes twisted or perverted, and it becomes rage or fury instead of just a healthy, normal anger. And that's true with a lot of things, aggression, all that kind of thing, violence. If we can find a place to live with it in a way that's conscious, it doesn't have the same power. It's like a cork, in a bottle. It wants to just flay out when it can. Another great example of repressed shadow material is the religious right, the leaders of the religious right, who have so often these terrible, dramatic sex scandals and drug scandals. So they're living this really one-sided life and judgmental about the very thing they're trying to keep down in themselves. The other film that I want to mention is a film called Collateral. Has anybody seen Collateral? It's a really interesting film. I didn't want to see it at first because I thought, it's another violent film, but it's got a great depiction of the shadow. So you have Tom Cruise, who's a hitman, and you have Jamie Foxx, who's a cab driver. And Tom Cruise kind of hijacks Jamie Foxx and the cab to drive him around all night to do 5 or 6 hits. And Jamie Foxx is a really nice guy. You love him. He's sweet, he's kind, he's meek, and he kind of gets trapped by this guy and coerced into driving him around. But what happens, and Jamie Foxx, by the way, he's a cab driver, has been a cab driver for 12 years, and he has a dream of having his own chauffeur limousine company. And as the audience, when he's talking about it, we know this is a pipe dream. This guy doesn't have the oomph to get up and go. He's going to be a cab driver the rest of his life. And so you see in the course of the evening, it's very fascinating how Jamie Foxx watches and learns the cunning and the ruthlessness of Tom Cruise. And what it does is it allows him, he incorporates that, so at the end he can save himself and also be the hero. And it's a great depiction of how to incorporate the darker side. And you have the feeling at the end he will be able now to have the courage and the gumption and the guts to do what he wants to do in his life. The third example is a French film called Man on the Train. Anybody? And that's a different way of looking at shadow. It's the story briefly about two men. One's a retired school teacher and the other one is a criminal, and they're thrown together by circumstance for about a week. And you can see that each has had the life that the other wanted. So it's a great depiction of what's been unlived. And one of the questions of midlife is, what's unlived in me? What's still in me that wants to find a place, that wants to manifest? And so it's very poignant in this film. For example, the school teacher has always wanted to be a criminal or a cowboy or something like that. So the criminal teaches him how to shoot a gun and how to drink whiskey. And on the other hand, the criminal's never had a home. So he asked the school teacher, can he borrow a pair of slippers? He's never had one. And I really recommend this film. I really, really recommend it. The other point about shadow is that it's not just individual work, because whatever shadow we haven't dealt with in ourselves will get played out into the collective. So it's really, to me, very crucial work in the world, especially now in major events where we see so much shadow coming out of people. So some of the tools that I've come up with are questions. For example, what do you judge or scorn in others? And there is that cliche that the things that we can't stand most about other people are really the things we can't stand about ourselves. So I think that's a good place to start looking for the shadow. The same with triggers. If you find yourself triggered, which to me means kind of an overreaction for objectively what's going on in the present. Like, look at what that is. What's the trigger? Why is it getting to you? What shadow aspect is it calling up in you? Another question is, what do you envy or admire in others? Because often that's some of that gold we were talking about. If you, for example, envy somebody because they're a great piano player and you think back to when you were 12 and you loved playing piano and you gave it up. Little clues like that of where your shadow is. There's a book by Debbie Ford called The Dark Side of the Light Chasers. And she gives an exercise in there that I really enjoyed. And she said, what are the traits that you would, in yourself, what are the traits that you would least want to be described as having if it were on the front page of the paper? And at the time, the two I came up with were vain and ungenerous. And I was really pretty shocked because I had to admit to myself I was vain and I didn't like being that way, and that I had to face the fact that in the way that I was generous, it was mostly giving to get. And it really started me looking at a more genuine way of being generous rather than this more manipulative way. So there's there's little ways, both with persona and shadow now, we can see certain ways that we can start, delving in, probing a little bit to see where we are with those things. So what I'm going to do, we have about 10 or 15 minutes till the break, and I'd like to open it up to questions or discussions of anything we've covered so far. Yeah, Kate.
You had mentioned Karen Mornay,
Mm-hmm.
and can you talk more about that in terms of what you were mentioning, the records?
The tyranny of the shoulds.
Yeah.
She's a very interesting woman, actually. She did a lot. She was almost pre-feminist, and I think the feminists kind of like dropped her. She kind of got lost between the cracks, I think. But she was talking, I think, a lot about the roles that women were playing, especially she was in the 40s, I think at her high point of writing, 30s, 40s, the roles and the shoulds that we all had to do in our lives. So I think she pointed out, especially to women, what's running us, how much of the shoulds were running people's shows versus what they really wanted and needed for themselves. Yeah. Yes?
What about addictions, where it could be part of yourself or it could be part of your shadow? How does that play into this?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. Addictions it's a huge topic, and just the other day, does anybody know Stephen Victor's work, his constellation work? I wasn't at his workshop this last weekend, but a friend of mine was, and she talked about him talking about addictions serving the soul, that it's hell on the personality, but it serves the soul in some way. So I don't know where I am with that, but I wanted to bring it up to put it in the room since you've asked that question. My personal belief about addictions is that I think it keeps us from feeling. I think most addictions, maybe this is not true, but my sense is that most addictions are to not feel pain, at least. And for me, for instance, with defense mechanisms, let's take that for one thing. In order to get below the defense, in my view, you have to feel the feeling that it's defending. So I'll give you a personal example of this. I had a son who was doing his homework, and he was having trouble with it. And I was starting to shame him until I realized that I was having trouble with it. I couldn't understand it. And I had to really feel how inadequate I felt and how much shame. And I'm only bringing this up now to say I think with addiction, so often we use the addiction so we won't have to feel those deeper levels of pain, or to even be with our aloneness, or even existential aloneness. So I have a hard time personally feeling like it's a part of the self. I think it's the shadow, and I think it does. When you delve into addiction work, you will get to what's in there. So I don't know. Did I answer your question well enough?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
I was just wondering, in your definition of the shadow, does it also include, like, at least in our society, everything that you call metaphysical?
Oh, well, I guess for some people it would be. I mean, that's the thing. The shadow's all relative, isn't it? Because one person's shadow is the other person's light. And there's a shadow to metaphysics, which would be more maybe occultish or satanic. I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, I was just thinking about how many people, say, in our society, see ghosts, see elves, see angels. All that would be caused within our society, likely to be tossed into that.
Not the society that's in this room, but
Correct.
more like Middle America. Yeah. Yeah,
Interesting way of defining the shadow.
It's a really interesting way, and maybe that's their shadow and our light, or whatever.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, you were talking about, or what would be an example of a Jungian technique that would help a person reclaim parts of the shadow that are, that you would want to reclaim?
Well, some of the questions that I was asking, there's another way that, since you ask, I'm going to mention it, but I wasn't going to get into it. And this would be a great whole workshop, actually. It's about, does anybody know what a mandorla is? Mandorla. No? Melissa. This is the mandorla. It's like an event diagram. It's the place where both things are true at once, or the same, two different things are overlap in the same set. So there's a great book, and at the back, there's a reading and a film list, a real basic one, and I've mentioned this book on there. It's called Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. Anybody know the book? So, and this is the only book I've ever found mention of mandorlas, and evidently it was something from old Christian art, or something like that. But Robert Johnson, who's a big Jungian, uses this a lot. So for instance, he'll talk about, I'm going to give another example for right now, and then we'll take it into shadow. It can be used for any polarity or any split that you have in your personality. So I'll give a personal example. And this is a big part of my midlife. At one point in my midlife, I couldn't stand all my responsibilities. I just wanted to be free. But I really didn't want to leave my situation, right? So at the beginning, freedom and responsibility seemed completely mutually exclusive. I didn't see how I could do both. I felt really torn in half. I was very miserable. And I started reading that book, and I thought, okay, there must be a moment in my day where I can feel free and responsible at the same time. And I remember thinking, I don't know which one of the Black Panthers it was who was in jail. I don't know if it was Malcolm X or Eldridge Cleaver or one of those guys, but I remember reading a passage where he felt like a free man, even that he was in prison. So I thought, if he could do it, I've got to find a way. I mean, my life isn't that bad. And I remember the mandorla started with sitting, having a cup of tea in my kitchen and looking out the window. And I thought, okay, I'm free. I feel really free right now. My spirit feels free. And yet I feel responsible. I'm doing what I need to do. And what he'll talk about is taking whatever issues you're working with and working that edge of the mandorla so it gets bigger and bigger. And what eventually happens, and I think this can only be theoretical, is when the two circles really do overlap, there's no more notion of freedom or responsibility. There's no more polarity. And that's one way of addressing the whole duality situation. And it's a lifetime's work. It never gets done. But in this way, a third thing arises. And this is what Jung would call the transcendent function, which is, for example, a compromise would be, okay, for 3 days I'm going to be free, and for 4 days I'm going to be responsible. And compromises usually aren't very satisfying to either party or either side, right? So what Jung talked about is actually developing new solutions. So a third thing. So one might call this a free responsibility or responsible freedom. It becomes a third thing. And I think it's the same with shadow work. That when you start taking, so say I have a problem with anger, maybe, okay, how about like the bully and the saint? Jekyll and Hyde in a way, right? So how can you start integrating? Like we said, how could you get the parts back into the whole? How can you become a little less saint-like and use some of that bully energy in a different way? So it's so individual, but I think that's the kind of mindset that you start with. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I just had a thought, and I've said this to you before, there's a freedom in feeling you could feel like a bully and a saint at the same time and feel comfortable in both things being true at the same time. That kind of thing has really helped me. As you know, I can be really angry and feel really calm, and it's okay at the same time.
Right.
Or feel really confused and teary and really kind of strong and ballsy at the same time. And it all being true at the same time makes it okay. It's not, you don't have
That's
to
a
be
great
one or
point.
the other. And then as they integrate together, that really is who we are.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. It's like that, living with that paradox.
Yeah.
Which is, if you just focused on living in the paradox the rest of your life, you'd have plenty of work. But I think that's where we start entering into even higher states of consciousness and higher order levels of existence by working these edges in here. Yes,
I wanted
Jean?
to ask, really, what do you consider, at what age do you begin the midlife, and then what age do you end the midlife?
I think it's all up for grabs. I mean, okay, I'm going to throw a bunch of thoughts out that I just had with that question. Number one, some psychologists now say adolescence finishes at 30. But I also think there's much more overlap than we think. And I know people who are 35 who would be having what we call a midlife crisis. Also, Jung said that some of the things we're talking about tonight, it was his view, I think, if I've interpreted it right, that can't be done in the first half of life. But I also wonder if kids were clued into at least these ideas, that once they had certain experiences, they could put it into a different framework instead of waking up at 45 thinking, what the heck has happened to me? Everything I believed in is not true. So I think the question is really a fluid one. I think it depends on the person. Things are happening so fast and kids are being exposed to so much so early. I don't really know how the chronological part of it will change or how it really is now. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Well, that kind of raises a question because, we are living really differently now, and, we're really different at midlife than our parents were. Our lives there's a lot more possibilities for us, and we can look forward to longer lives. We're a lot more active than our parents were at this age, and so forth. So I'm wondering if there are Jungian thinkers that are really kind of working with evolving the work because things are very different from when Jung came up with these ideas.
I think that's a good question, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of it. The books I've read are pretty much staying with the model. Even James Hollis has written six books. Some of them are on the reading list, and they're a lot about midlife, but they operate a lot on that model. Yeah, maybe that's a book I should write. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? The break is usually in 10 minutes. I can start on the shadow, and then we can break after that if you want. Isn't it at 10?
Break now, if you want.
Break now? Why don't we break now? It's kind of more organic, and then at 8 we'll come back and we'll do the shadow. Okay, so I want to move along now to the Anima and the Animus. Who's familiar with those terms? Okay, they're a little bit jargony, and I'm going to keep using them, but I know that they're a little hard to relate to. The definition again is, for a man, the anima is what he's internalized as his image of a woman, like what the template of woman is for man. And the animus for a woman is what she's internalized as a template for a man. So it's really what our conceptions and our beliefs and our imprinting is about the opposite sex. okay? This is much more complex than persona or shadow issues. Persona and shadow have more to do with self, and Anima and Animus has more to do with self and other eventually. Of course, it starts with self and the idea that what we believe about the opposite sex internally, but eventually it has to correspond with your work with the other. So I also want to make a note here about same-sex relationships, because the feminists, when Jung did all this, he was basing everything on a heterosexual model, and the feminists have not liked that at all. And my belief about it is it's about feminine and masculine energy, about the yin and yang, and so it doesn't matter the gender. All the things that we can say about it are true even in a same-sex situation, but I will be speaking in a heterosexual way tonight just to make it less confusing for me. So, so there's two arenas for the Anima and the Animus. There's personal in the ways that we've been conditioned by, our parents, our mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and in our family, and the other part is the collective, what's been imprinted upon us socially and culturally. So we'll start with the personal aspects. Who here has experienced repetitive patterns in romantic relationships? So, Jung has a lot to explain about this. So if you think of having your inner template about the opposite sex, it's almost like you develop a radar or a filter, right? I think we've all heard the stereotyped abused woman who keeps on picking abusive partners even though they look very different one from the other. She'll say, he seems so different than, number one. Number two seems so different. And it's almost like we have this strange kind of radar, isn't it, that we can focus in and find exactly that same type, even though they look completely different on the outside. And from the Jungian perspective, it's the idea is as within, so without. What we've internalized and what we believe is what we're going to find or attract or only see. We may not even see these other possibilities. There's a movie by Fellini, 8½. Anybody seen it? And I don't know if y'all remember, but there's a scene where he's dreaming about all his Anima women. And you've got some nuns in there. You've got, I think, a woman with black stilettos and a whip and fishnets. You've got like a bitchy castrating woman. You've got all these different women, and none of them seem what we would call healthy or well-balanced. And it was a really great example of if that's all you've known, if that's what your experience of women has been, how do you even recognize something else outside of what you've been exposed to? So it's a really difficult work, the work with the Anima and the Animus, but it is about changing some of those inner figures. The other side and the other part of this is projection and idealization. So here's another question. Who's ever fallen in love? And who's ever been disillusioned about who they fell in love with, right? So there's usually a gap somewhere. I mean, there's the lucky few that manage to work beyond that. But in the gap where the projections are and the idealizations are is a wealth of information about yourself, because what you project on someone else says much more about you than about the other person. I recently have started rereading a book, a novel called The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Anybody read it? Anybody know it? By Carson McCullers. And it's the story of a deaf mute, and he befriends all these different people, very, very different people, one to the other, and they all go to him and they bear his soul, and they think that he really understands them. Not only that he understands them, but that he's like them. So he presents this kind of blank screen, and it's fascinating to see all the different characters, how they're thinking he's somebody else. They think that they're a reflection of themselves. And so that's what we do so often. These people are blank screens, and to the extent, a lot of times we can't really take in who they really are. We're busy fantasizing or projecting or hoping. And so that's on the personal level. On the collective level, there is something called the myth of romantic love. And I think that it's a very strong cultural template. We see it in movies, we see it in songs, we see it in advertisements. Romance sells, not just sex, but romance. And so the hope that we have and that our culture really perpetuates is that there's a soulmate out there for us, and we're going to find that person. We're going to find our other half instead of two wholes coming together, it's two halves coming together. And there's a big difference between filling a hole and expressing a fullness of self, right? But there's not very many models for all that. It's also another way of looking outside for what, according to Jung and lots of other people, we need to find inside. So we believe through this myth that the other is going to save us, heal us, make us happy, make us whole, even provide us a life in some cases. There's a woman, Jungian, Mary Louise von Franz, who says that also to look for that in another person, we give up following our own star. And I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. My husband, Tom, recently went to a wedding. And the couple was around 20 years old. And he overheard some of the bride's friends saying to one another, well, now it's up to him to make her happy. And that really shocked me, that still in all, and in Ashland, in the Ashland bubble on top of it, that was a belief. And I think even though we give a lot of lip service to things being differently, I think that hope is really, really a hard one to reconcile with. There's some people who say that the cult of romantic love or the myth of romantic love has replaced religion or spirituality. It tries to answer the question, what's my meaning in life? Why am I here? What's my purpose? And we also seek a transcendence from a romantic relationship that people used to from religion or spirituality. This is a really, really tricky territory. We could do a whole week just on Anima and Animus, but I did want to try to leave with each of these things at least some ideas to start thinking about and cogitating about. I read recently somebody's definition of when a projection was happening is a denial of the obvious. Mm-hmm. And I just love that. And this is where friends, close friends, can be great reality checks, because our blind spots are just that. There are blind spots. And we could, we're not going to see them no matter how hard we look. So one of the tricks is to start recognizing when there is a projection or an idealization happening, or when you're not catching the red flags of your same patterns. And sometimes friends can be great, great reality checks. The other thing about romantic love is to try to explore the fascination without what they call leaving home. So to try to somehow stay grounded without losing yourself. And it's so tricky because that swept away feeling, who would say no to that? But if there's a way to have some of it but stay still grounded in yourself, and that way you can also understand more what's happening, what's projection, what's real, what's the potential, what's fantasy land. And I had this thought the other day. I wrote a poem in the middle of the night, and I don't write poems. I really don't write poems. And I felt this thing, I just had to do it. I wrote this poem, And it was a few days ago, or maybe a week ago, but when I was preparing for this speech, and I thought, I want to say this in this room, that it's like there's this poetry in all of us, right? There's this poetry in all of us, and we want to give that one special other all our poetry. And I really started wondering, is there a way we can just give our poetry to everybody? Or to more than that one special someone? Because it chokes you up, doesn't it? It backs up, and you've got all this to give, and we think in this model we have to give it to that one person. So I don't know, that to me just seemed like a piece of the inspiration of how to work more with this Anima, Animus, romantic love business. I actually am going to mention right now that I'm really interested in starting a class on these points to go more in depth, and I do have a sign-up sheet in the back. If there is enough interest, I'll start one probably in February. So just for you to sign up if you want at the end of the class, at the end of the talk. The next thing I want to talk about is the dark night of the soul. Who's ever had one? Who's in one right now? They are wonderful and terrible. They're blessings in disguise as far as I can see. They can facilitate and really, mainline us to some of these points. Instead of kind of a slow burn over 20 years, you might get to it real quick, but of course it's devastating. Can I hear some adjectives? Can people throw out what it feels like for them, the dark night?
Despair.
I didn't hear. Back there? No? I still didn't hear.
Fog.
Fog, okay.
Fuck.
Fucked. Beep.
Hopeless.
Uh-huh.
Depressing.
Adrift.
Devastating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the words, the things I came up with is also no sense of solid ground. The sense, the feeling that I'd based my life on nothing to do with reality. A falling away of all the known territory that I was familiar with. Also a tearing down of the old so that the new can be built. I read also, was serendipity the other day. I've been recently in a kind of a dark night, and I'm just coming out of the tail end of it. And I've been feeling this thing, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Has anybody read that book by Kundera? And it's kind of this existential floatiness, as the best I can describe it. And I read an article about that very thing, and it was a psychology article. And the man, the author pointed out that that's really when you're going from one, level of being to another. Not necessarily a hierarchy, but everything you'd based your life on has changed at that point. And so of course there's this floaty until you find the next basis. And of course, the work is always to try and get to that ground of being that is in our essence and that stays stable and solid over time, but it does get really shaken up. And of course, all this, the dark night happens often through something external, a tragedy, death, illness, divorce, a betrayal. Betrayals are wonderful for dark nights of the souls. They're usually the best wake-up calls we can get. And disillusionment can be one of our best teachers if we can stick with it and pay attention. Jung said, and I love this thought, he believed that the psyche actually organizes these events and circumstances so that the self can become more manifest by clearing away so much unconscious material and working with all the stuff that comes up. And they are, I think, blessings in disguise to bring us to greater self-understanding and eventually a higher consciousness. I've had two in my midlife. And the first one was tore down a lot of illusions about the way the world works, and a lot of grandiose delusions about myself, a lot. And the second one tore down a lot of my defense mechanisms. And both were very humbling in the best possible sense of the word. It brought me down to earth. It brought me to, I think, a clearer reality, and I feel more human, actually. I felt like I was both times taken down a bunch of notches, but I felt like I needed to descend to ascend. So I think the deal is, and now, so with my second dark night, it was a lot easier because I thought, oh, this is productive. You know, I could really, even in feeling devastated, I knew, I had the faith and the knowledge, because I'd lived through another one, that it was going to come to something. So someone said it was fucked, and it is fucked, but it's also such a great thing. It's such a great thing to be able to get through. And I want to read you this quote from John Sanford, who's a Jungian author, and he writes about the biblical story of Jacob wrestling with his angel. I don't know the Bible very well, so maybe some of you do, or his devil, depending on how you look at it. Jacob refused to part with his experience until he knew its meaning. Everyone who wrestles with his spiritual and psychological experience, and no matter how dark or frightening it is, refuses to let it go until he discovers its meaning, is having something of the Jacob experience. Such a person can come through his dark struggle to the other side reborn, but one who retreats or runs from his encounter with spiritual reality cannot be transformed. In both of my cases, the things that happened were so devastating that I thought, I never want to recreate these things again, so I better find out what was unconscious in me that brought those things to me. And they were both things I invited when I looked back. I invited it. It wasn't like I crossed the street and a car ran me over. So it really, actually, now that I think about it, the first dark night, without it, I wouldn't be up here teaching. It actually brought me to a level of my calling that I wouldn't have imagined. I couldn't have imagined at the time. It was only in hindsight. So it's hard to tell where the gifts are in life often. I needed to find out what unconscious motivations were running me. And, you know, I found a lot out about myself. I think sometimes in dark nights, people need to lose something before they start to change or before they wake up. But I really think if you start working with it, with the events early enough, that you can change before you have to lose it. It's been my experience. I want to quote from Dante's Inferno about his experience of the dark night. Midway in my life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood. How shall I say what wood was that? I never saw so drear, so rank, so arduous a wilderness. Its very memory gives a shape to fear. Its very memory gives a shape to fear. Death could scarce be more bitter than that place. But since it came to good, I will recount all that I found revealed there by God's grace. And so I just want to remind you who are in one or going to have one that it's really rich, rich, rich place. I'm going to recap a little bit what we've talked about tonight. Number one, the task of persona is to become congruent in our inner and outer life. The task of the shadow is to integrate our unlived or repressed parts into our lived lives. And the task of Anima or Animus is to reconcile our personal and collective feminine and masculine issues. And I want to get back also to the point I made at the beginning about inspiration. And there's so much liberation possible with the gifts and opportunities of midlife. the idea that we can be liberated from holding so much of our persona and shadow material in place, from being stuck in relationship patterns or holding on to the myth of romantic love, to find meaning in our struggle and our pain and difficulty, and to start connecting the dots of the story of our own lives so we can find the hero's journey in it or the heroine's journey in it, and to even come to a point where our wounds are shown to us as our gifts. And it really makes for a rich life. I want to finish with a word about time. And there's at least two versions of time. One is chronological time, which we all understand and get to work on time and do what we have to do. And then there's what I think of as soul time. And the timeline for soul time is eternity. So there's a slower pace to it. It's about process. It's, you know, the soul doesn't care that we want to get it done early so we can still be young and healthy to enjoy where we've gotten. The soul is just going at its own pace. And this reminds me of an anecdote from Einstein and one of his colleagues. They were working on a very big project, and the colleague says to Einstein, "My God, Einstein, this is going to take forever." And Einstein said, "Well, then there's no rush then, is there?" So I want to make a couple announcements, and then I'm going to open it to questions and comments again. I have in the back an email list for anybody who wants to keep in the loop of what I'm doing. I'm starting a women's themes through film class. Men are very welcome, even though it's about women. And that's at SOU Extension, and there's a flyer about that in back. I'm also co-teaching an Enneagram class, and we're going to do one type per day per month and go in depth to each type. And the first one's starting next Sunday, and it's for Enneatype 4. Then I've left a reading and film list, I mentioned that, and again, that sign-up sheet for anybody who'd want to work in smaller groups and really go into depth and do a study group on this material. So if I get enough interest, I'll make it happen. And so I'd like to open it now up to questions or discussion. Thank God.
I know I'm hogging on.
I love it.
I mean, on the Anima and the Animus, I mean, sort of the standard psychological thing would be that, I mean, the standard psychological story is you get that template from your parents. And what did Jung have to say about that? I mean, it seems like that could be really limiting in terms of how you see men and women and how you relate.
I think, I'm not sure, don't quote me, but my impression is that it's a lot from there. It's a lot from your parents or any important caregivers, or it could be teachers. It's any, anything that has been reinforced enough to become patterned in you, imprinted, really. And I think the cultural thing is enormous. I'm going to use this opportunity to get on a soapbox about the battle of the sexes. And I don't know if any of you guys get these emails about, men are like this, women are like that. Like, women need like 20 things to be in the mood, like flowers and candles, and men need a beer and a Naked or a Playboy magazine or something. And I get these emails, and I think they're kind of perpetuating this cultural template of Anima and Animus. It may have been true, it might still be true, but I'm trying to think of an email I can make up that's not preachy, but that shows a different template. To move into, because I don't think either side is very happy with the cultural template that we get. I don't think. It seems like a lot of people are complaining. So, and then that now this just came to me, how inspiring is that to start living it differently yourself, to start changing the cultural template by how you're working with Anima and Animus. Are you going to hold women to what they've been culturally? Am I going to hold men culturally to what they've been, like putting the toilet seats up all the time or whatever? I mean, no, I don't want to do that. And then what starts happening as you change all that inside culturally and, question, is this true? Are men really like this? Are women really like this? It starts working in on you, and you start seeing things differently, I think. So what other ways could you imagine it coming from besides parents or early experiences?
Well, I mean, certainly the culture has got a lot to say about it. I mean, I think it's got to start with the parents. I mean, I have a son who's adopted. I think it's got to be really interesting for a child who doesn't know his birth parents and can really only imagine who they were. But I would also think that it's probably got to be a sign of your own self-development if you find yourself kind of breaking free of those templates. In other words, let's say, if you're attracting people to you in relationships who don't fit the template that you got, say, from your parent, of that gender, so much.
Mm-hmm.
That you're breaking free of the limitations of those templates.
Yeah, and that's the edge. That's the mandorla's in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And what I found is really helpful. I noticed a lot of movement in my dreams. I'm a big dreamer, and I remember my dreams a lot. And I've noticed over time the male images in my dreams have changed a lot. So I think it's really interesting. Also, and Jungians are big on dream work anyway. How the dream life and the waking life, the conscious and the unconscious, start kind of dancing more. You get some glimmer in your dream. You bring it into your waking life in some way with some realization, and then that feeds back into your dream. And there's this kind of working together, I think, at a certain point. Yeah. Anybody else?
I'm wondering if you could just repeat the summary at the end, the 3 points.
Sure.
Could you do that?
So the task of persona is to become more congruent, more in alignment, your inner and outer, so more true to yourself. The task of the shadow is to integrate our unlived or repressed parts into our lived lives. So whatever we've rejected or repressed or been too afraid to live, too. I mean, it can be that some people are afraid to be their biggest self or more creative self. I mean, it's risky. Okay, and the task of Anima and Animus is to reconcile these personal and collective feminine and masculine issues.
And I don't want to monopolize things, but just in a sentence, can you just say what that means, kind of? I mean,
The last thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's to come to terms with identifying what your template is, like what your notions of men are, and for that matter, what your notions of women are, because we also have templates for our same-sex gender. Women who don't like other women, for example. There's something going on there about the relationship with their mother and what they've internalized about what being a woman is. So it's coming to terms with, what is it that you really believe about men? And what was your father like? What were early males like? What cultural input did you get? Are you happy with how it is? Is it working for you? I mean, that's the other thing. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Jung said something like, if you're happy, don't go there. Don't bother. If you've found a way to have enough well-being, don't ask for trouble. But if it's not working for you, yeah, sure. We can talk about that more too.
You said that it worked for same-sex couples, but I wonder about children that are raised by same-sex couples and their templates, and whether they're more influenced by their parents or whether they're more influenced by the collective, by the culture that they live in?
I think that's an interesting question, because also it depends where if they're raised in a place where it's not thought of anything unusual, or if it's raised in a place where it is. And it seems like such a new thing. We don't really know the results of that, or if it'll make any difference at all.
I have a lot of friends that have gay parents, and they're mostly into straight things. Like, they're into girls and they're opposite sex. I see it a lot, and I know people that have parents that are traditional. They get married to someone of the opposite sex, and they become ragingly gay and super open about it. And so I've seen like the best of both worlds, and I can honestly say from my experience, I don't think it has an effect. I think that once a person is individualized, like, you make up your own mind at that point. I mean, there's something to say about DNA and patterns and even subliminally conditioning motifs that are all over the media. But I think ultimately, once a person finds what they want to do, it's them. And I do think there is room for somebody to be highly influenced beyond what they've seen outside of just that little paradigm that they're in, whether it's just the little circle in their family or whatever.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes?
Or I guess on that one, I wonder if maybe like if someone has a single parent, like just a mother, and never has men around. That happens a lot. And I think in that case, you might see a shadow or something where they're attracted to men who are maybe unavailable in some way, or there might be some dynamic. I'm just making that up, but perhaps there's some kind of process that happens when they don't have any kind of male role.
For a boy child?
For a girl.
I think I've seen it all over the place, all over the map too. I've seen, where a girl who hasn't had a father is almost like man crazy, or I see where they're fine, and I think it probably they pick up. I'm imagining a lot of cues from the mother. I think a lot of times, actually they'll even say that a child can pick up the animus or anima from its same-sex parent. So you get things passed down to you. Actually, that's a more complete answer to your question too, of it can pass down through generational myths too. And we won't even talk about past lives and things like that. But yeah, so it's really hard to say. And for me, it always keeps coming back to, even in a couple, the more well-balanced we are, the better the whole family is. Because there's a whole, I think, systemic thing in a family. If someone's not, if four people aren't picking up their own shadow, there'll be a scapegoat in the family that'll pick up a lot of the shadow. It's almost like there's this homeostasis that wants to be found within a couple or the family. And so, to me, the answer always comes back to, clean my own house. And I find it I'm still married, and I find it a lot of times we get polarized. My husband tends to be really optimistic, overly optimistic, and so I'll take kind of the negative road. It used to be unconscious, now I'm more savvy to what I do to make a balance. And so this is another great example of working the mandorla. We've talked about it, and he's becoming a little bit more, how shall we say, skeptical or real. I call it realistic, but he calls it negative. And I'm becoming a little more, okay, everything is probably, if I'm not vigilant, everything will be okay anyway, So this is the really great thing when a couple can start working on their issues with each other. Then it can really start pumping, I think. But it's the same in the family. We noticed with the kids, before we kind of caught on to what we were doing, we scapegoated one of our kids, and the more we got in balance in ourselves, the better off everyone was.
Yeah, that really brings up the point, I think, where you were talking about trying to find your true self. Rather, in the statement that you made, I thought that was the most interesting, was not the person that's trying to please someone or emulate someone, but to be careful not to rebound or have a reaction formation and go in the opposite direction of what your true self is, just because your parents or the collective or whatever says this is the way it should be, then you're like hell or high water.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
My father says to be a doctor, so I'm going to become, you know, a prostitute. Or
Right.
whatever.
Right, because you're just as controlled.
Yeah, I mean,
I think doctor, prostitute, doctor.
not that far, right?
No, but it's true. It's just you're just as much as controlled if you're being counter what's being presented. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's what was occurring there, but it's interesting that, you know, perhaps maybe your true self really is to be super optimistical and
Right. I think I'm somewhere in between, but yeah. It's really interesting. There's a great, this is completely off the wall, but I love this quote, and it's about the paradox of a relationship, and it goes something very close to, I alone must become myself, but I cannot become myself alone. Which is a really beautiful thing about relationship. And any relationship, not just romantic, any friendship, anything. We need each other to have mirrors and to rub up against and to find where our edges are, find where our work is. Yeah, Kate?
Can you speak to the archetypes?
The archetypes are, I'm glad you asked that question. They are, what Jung thought they were is that we have, in the collective unconscious, there are archetypes floating around, like the hero. We all recognize the hero, right? We all recognize the villain. We all recognize the good mother. And then the cultural archetypes, like, for instance, the Virgin Mary could be the archetype for the good mother. So he believed that there are these recognizable archetypes universally, and then we develop our own personal archetypes based on what's happened to us. So if we've had a mother, let's say the wicked stepmother, you know, we've had a stepmother who's really been mean, so that archetype becomes a part of our inner psyche. So one way that I've really liked working with archetypes personally is that when I started doing some of this work, I had some really difficult things to do in the outside world, and I kind of thought, my first thought was, okay, what would Meg Ryan do if she was this movie? I know, I'm really embarrassed to admit that, but I thought, and before I even knew about archetypes, that was trying to draw on some archetypal energy, to say, okay, what would my heroic self, the self that could step up and do the right thing, what would she do? And so that's the way I first started saying, sometimes we draw from those images, not to confuse ourselves and be grandiose about, you know, I'm Joan of Arc or something, but what is some of that energy? Do I need to be the hero? Do I need, I need to talk to my kid's principal or whatever because he's been suspended. I need to pull in a little hero energy because I want to advocate for my son, for example. Or what about for the feminine? Sometimes I forget that I'm a woman and I need to bring some, kind of archetypal femininity into my life. So that's one of the ways to work with archetypes. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering how much influence you think some of the, the mythological archetypes are influencing us now, like the fairy tales and...
Well, in Jungian terms, they think that because the same themes seem to tend to come into fairy tales of all cultures and countries, and the same with myths. They often, there's really only so many themes that keep circulating, even in personal stories, right? So there's something about all of that, and personally it is helpful. Like, for instance, one of the myths that I really like is one about Daphne. And Daphne is, she was a nymph, I think, like a wood nymph, and Apollo was in love with her and wanted to possess her. And she ran and ran until Zeus, I think, protected her and turned her into a tree She'd rather be a tree than to be caught. And there's a wonderful essay by Thomas More where he says, you know, we think to be intimate, we need to always want to be possessed or want to possess, but there's a Daphne in all of us that needs to be free and needs to flee closeness and needs to regress a little bit into ourselves. So that's a way, for example, that I use a myth to help myself to say, oh, I'm in a Daphne mood. You know, I want a lot of space today, and instead of with the current, maybe not so current model of the joined at the hip kind of intimacy, I think that's changing, but that's another talk. I feel okay about that. Daphne needs her place. So I think, you know, if there's something in mythology that speaks to you, or even a movie or a book that really plays with your imagination, it's something to pay attention to. It's information about yourself.
What does Jung say about the archetypes? I mean, does he say that there are specific ones that we all kind of culturally adhere to and we've absorbed, and that's just a part of our psyche?
As I understand it, yeah. You know, there's all kinds. And he found that, he thought it to be universal over cultures and over time. Anybody else? Yes?
Does your diagram there speak specifically to midlife in some way?
You know, not necessarily, except that I think in Jung's view that you couldn't do this work in the first half of life, which like we were talking about before, I'm not so sure anymore that that's true. But I think anybody who wanted to as a model, and I don't think you need to go to a therapist necessarily to do this kind of thing, can start looking at that and asking those questions. So I don't think it's just for midlife, but I think it's been a good model for me in my midlife. Yes?
I missed the part about the shadow, but I'm kind of wondering if the shadow is just exactly what would most offend me if I heard someone else doing it or saying it. Would that be a way of getting quickly in touch with my shadow?
Did you miss it because you weren't here? Or?
I wasn't here.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the things. If you get triggered by, you know, that cliche that what most annoys you in other people is really because it's something you hate in yourself, that kind of thing. What triggers you, what you have judgment on. I mean, I know that I am dealing with my shadow when I'm judging somebody. I mean, it's really clear, and I feel it in my body. A judgment versus just a clean observation. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's helpful for bringing out the shadow, to notice that?
I think, because I think the first step in any of this is awareness and consciousness. So whatever bits of information you can find out about yourself, you know, it already starts the process of change, I think. Because you can never have the same relationship with it. When it pops up again, you'll go, oh, it's back again. There's in that book, Owning Your Own Shadow, Robert Johnson talks about, this is a little anecdote from his life, but he had a house guest who overstayed their welcome, and he was real polite to the house guest all the time. He never, you know, asked him to leave or just catered to him and all that. And then he goes out, finally the house guest leaves, he goes out to a nursery or something to buy a plant or to make a purchase. And he said he started being really rude and mean to the clerk who hadn't done anything. And he said he realized that was his shadow. He hadn't dealt with what he needed to deal with his friend. He hadn't been straight. He hadn't done his work. And so he passed it on to someone else. And that's something, too, to look at, I guess.
You've talked a lot tonight about how you know, by feeling different things in your body, that's a cue to you that some particular thing is going on. Back when Jung was writing, was he also talking about those kinds of things?
You know, I'm not sure, but my guess is not so much.
I would guess not, too.
I think it was really Willem Reich who started the first movement towards body work, and I think maybe they were working at the same time, or Reich was a little bit after, I'm not sure. But I don't think so. I know that Jung talked about the 4 types, the intuitive, feeling, mental, and kinesthetic. But I'm not sure exactly how much he focused on sensation. It's a good question. Yeah, that was part of one of my tasks of coming into midlife, as I realized I had left my body. And I got kind of clued into that from, I did a Vipassana meditation retreat for 10 days, silent, and part of that process is focusing on sensations. And he'd talk about people being able to feel their kidneys and their organs, and I'm thinking, my God, all I can feel is where the fabric hits my skin. And I thought, my God, I have left my body over the years. And that, it became, through yoga and swimming and things, some body work, I started coming back more into my body. But that was the key to it. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but that is something that I think, I'm not sure, but I think a lot of women leave their bodies along the way. A lot of women I know anyways. So, and you can't be present if you're not in your body.
So maybe then, speaking of leaving your body, I certainly have left mine in my lifetime, but then there's this period of integration where your body physically has to catch up with you being in it, because a lot of damage gets done when you don't, not that you're abusing it so much, but you're abusing it by not giving it light in life.
Right, exactly. And if there's been any trauma, there's that too. Yeah, yeah, good point. Okay, anybody else? Feel free to email me or get in touch if any more thoughts come up or questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.